the scapegoat and the savior. The summer sun hung high over Willow Ridge, casting long, judgmental shadows across the town square. Amara Daniels clutched her bag tightly as she walked past the bakery, the post office, and the bank, places she once frequented without a second thought. Now, each step was a minefield. Every glance, every whispered word, carried the weight of years of loathing. She kept her gaze down, her feet moving briskly, but it wasn't enough. "Hey, trash!" Grant Hargrove's voice boomed across the square. Amara froze, her heart sinking. She knew better than to stop, but his words wrapped around her like a noose. Turning toward the voice, she saw him leaning against his truck with a group of his cronies. Grant, the spitting image of his father, Clayton Hargrove, wore a smirk as sharp as a knife. "What's the rush? Don't want to chat with your biggest fans?" he taunted, stepping forward. The square seemed to hold its breath. People stopped and stared, some with curiosity, others with silent approval. Amara's cheeks burned, but she bit her tongue. She'd learned long ago that speaking back only made things worse. "Just leave me alone," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Grant's grin widened. "Leave you alone? Oh, sweetheart, you've been the town's entertainment ever since my daddy put you in your place. We're just having a little fun." Before she could react, he reached into the truck bed and grabbed a trash bag, tearing it open. The rancid smell of leftover food and damp paper hit her nose as he dumped the contents over her. A wave of laughter erupted from the onlookers. Amara stood frozen, garbage sliding off her shoulders and falling to the ground. Her breath hitched, and tears burned her eyes, but she wouldn't let them see her cry. She bent down, her hands trembling, and began picking up the trash. "That's right, clean it up," Grant sneered. "You're good at that, aren't you?" A voice cut through the crowd, sharp and commanding. "That's enough." The laughter died instantly. Amara looked up to see a tall man stepping forward, his dark suit and polished shoes out of place in the dusty square. His face was unfamiliar, but his presence was impossible to ignore. "Who the hell are you?" Grant spat, narrowing his eyes. "Someone who doesn't tolerate this kind of behavior," the man replied evenly. His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it that silenced any retort. He turned to Amara and extended a hand. "Are you all right?" Amara hesitated, unsure if this was another trick. Grant glared at Amara, then at the man, before muttering, "Whatever. Let's go." He climbed into his truck, slamming the door as his friends piled in after him. As the truck roared away, the man turned back to Amara. "I'm Nicholas Thornton," he said, offering a small smile. "I just moved here. I think you just saw the closest thing I have to friends." Nicholas's brow furrowed. "I don't understand. Why do they treat you like this?" Amara hesitated. The story was too long, too painful, and too complicated to explain to a stranger. "It's a long story," she said finally. "I've got time," he replied, his tone kind but insistent. Something in his demeanor made Amara believe he meant it. She found herself telling him about Clayton Hargrove, how he'd ruined her reputation with lies and turned the entire town against her, how her career as a teacher had been destroyed. "If we stand together, we can face it head-on. I can protect you, and maybe, just maybe, you can help me understand this town and its secrets." Amara stared at him, her mind racing. The offer was absurd. She barely knew him. Shadows of the past. Amara woke up the next morning to the sound of birds chirping outside her window, but the weight of yesterday still lingered. She replayed Nicholas Thornton's words in her mind. "Marry me." Was he serious? The man didn't even know her. Yet, for the first time in years, someone had stood up for her. She couldn't help but wonder if his impulsive offer was her chance at a new beginning, or a dangerous gamble. Her thoughts were interrupted by the loud screech of tires outside. Peeking through the curtains, she saw Clayton Hargrove's shiny black car pulling into her driveway. Her stomach churned. The last thing she needed was a visit from the man who had ruined her life. Clayton stepped out, his tailored suit as immaculate as always, his presence exuding arrogance. He adjusted his tie, then knocked on the door as if he owned the place. Amara opened it a crack, glaring at him. "What do you want?" "I heard about your little performance yesterday," Clayton drawled, his voice oozing mockery. Quite the spectacle. I see you've caught the eye of our town's newest millionaire. How charming. Amara's grip on the door tightened, but she said nothing. Clayton leaned closer, his expression darkening. Let me give you some advice. Stay away from Nicholas Thornton. He's an outsider. He doesn't know how things work around here, but I do. If you drag him into your pathetic little mess, I'll make sure he regrets it. Understand? Amara met his gaze, her anger simmering beneath the surface. Why do you care, Clayton? Afraid I might finally have someone in my corner? Clayton's smile twisted into a sneer. You're nothing, Amara. No one in this town will ever see you as anything more than a disgrace. Don't make me remind you why. He turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the doorway, her fists clenched. She watched as his car disappeared down the road, her mind racing. She had endured years of his threats and manipulation, but this was different. He was afraid of what Nicholas might bring to the table. Later that day, Amara found herself standing outside the Willow Ridge Inn, the decision weighing heavily on her. Nicholas's proposal still felt surreal, but Clayton's visit had made one thing clear. Staying silent and enduring was no longer an option. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. Nicholas was sitting by the window in the small dining room, a cup of coffee in hand. When he saw her, he smiled warmly, gesturing for her to join him. You came, he said, sounding genuinely pleased. Amara sat across from him, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. I've thought about what you said, she began. And I need to know, why would you do this? Why would you put yourself in the middle of all this? You barely know me. Nicholas leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. You're right. I don't know you, but I know enough. I've seen the way this town treats you, and I can't stand by and let it continue. You deserve better than this, Samara. And frankly, I think we can help each other. Help each other? She echoed, skeptical. He nodded. I didn't move to Willow Ridge for its charm. He crushed the newspaper in his hands and muttered, You've made a mistake, Nicholas. A big one. Digging for truth. Amara stared out the window of Nicholas's estate, her gaze fixed on the sprawling lawn that seemed like a world apart from her rundown house on the outskirts of Willow Ridge. Though the air here was cleaner, the weight on her chest hadn't lifted. In fact, it felt heavier. Being Mrs. Thornton might protect her from the mob for now, but she knew better than to believe the storm had passed. Nicholas entered the room, setting down a cup of tea beside her. You've been quiet all morning, he said, his voice gentle but probing. Amara sighed. I'm just waiting for the other shoe to drop. Clayton's got the whole town wrapped around his finger. Nicholas smiled, but it wasn't his usual warm expression. It was sharper, more calculated. He may control the town, but no one's untouchable. People like Clayton always have skeletons in their closet. We just need to find them. That evening, Amara found herself revisiting the place where it had all started, the abandoned schoolhouse. Once a lively hub for the community, it now stood as a decaying monument to her downfall. The whispers and rumors that Clayton had spread about her had cost her everything. Her job, her reputation, her future. She wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she felt drawn to the place. Nicholas had suggested they search for something, anything, that could expose Clayton, and she figured this was as good a place as any to start. As she rummaged through a forgotten filing cabinet in the teacher's lounge, her hand brushed against something brittle and yellowed. She pulled it out, a stack of old financial documents. Her eyes widened as she scanned the papers. They detailed discrepancies in school funding from years ago, just before the school's sudden closure. Funds had been funneled into a private account under a familiar name, Clayton Hargrove. Amara's heart raced as she pieced it together. Clayton hadn't just ruined her career. He had looted the school's budget and shut it down to cover his tracks. She stuffed the papers into her bag and hurried out of the building, her pulse pounding in her ears. Back at the estate, Amara laid the documents out on the dining table. Nicholas leaned over them, his expression grim but focused. Nicholas asked, his voice cold. Grant smirked, but there was unease in his eyes. Just a friendly visit, he said, stepping inside uninvited. Thought I'd congratulate you on your interesting choice of a bride. His gaze flicked to Amara, and his smirk deepened. Nicholas stepped in front of him, his voice sharp. Say what you came to say and leave. Grant's smirk faded. Fine. My father sent me to deliver a message. Back off. Whatever game you're playing, it's not worth it. Walk away now, and you'll save yourself a lot of pain. Nicholas didn't flinch. Tell your father we're just getting started. Grant's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Amara thought he might lash out. But instead, he turned on his heel and walked out, slamming the door behind him. As the sound echoed through the house, Amara turned to Nicholas. He knows. Nicholas nodded grimly. Good. Let him know. Let him sweat. Hargrove won't stop until he's destroyed me, and you. I hope one day you'll understand and forgive me. Amara closed the box, her chest tightening. She had never understood her mother's decision to leave, but now, the pieces were starting to fall into place. The first plot twist. Amara sat at the kitchen table, the stack of old letters from her mother spread out before her. Each word felt like a whisper from the past, carrying pain, regret, and something she hadn't seen before. Fear. Her mother had left without saying goodbye when Amara was only 9, leaving behind nothing but these letters, hidden in the attic like secrets too heavy to bear. She traced the faded ink of one particular letter, rereading it for what felt like the 100th time. He's more dangerous than you know. I had to protect you. If I stayed, I couldn't promise your safety. Trust no one. Keep your head down. Stay alive. Her fingers trembled. All her life, she had believed her mother had abandoned her out of selfishness. Now, she realized it had been out of desperation. And there was no doubt in her mind who her mother had been writing about, Clayton Hargrove. Amara leaned back in her chair, her heart pounding. This wasn't just her fight anymore. It had always been her mother's, too. Later that day, Nicholas returned from the town archives with more documents tucked under his arm. His expression was grim but determined. You won't believe this, he said, setting the papers down on the table. It's worse than we thought. Clayton's been siphoning money from town projects for years. School budgets, public infrastructure, even hospital funds. He's made millions off this town. Amara frowned. How has no one noticed? Nicholas shrugged. Because he owns everyone who could blow the whistle. Judges, accountants, even the mayor. He's insulated himself completely. Amara reached for the papers, scanning through them quickly. Her eyes caught on a specific project, a large housing development from years ago. It was never completed, yet funds had been withdrawn from the town's account and marked as finalized. Wait, she said, pointing at the page. This project, my mom worked on this before she left. She was part of the planning committee. Nicholas leaned in. Do you think she knew about the embezzlement? Amara hesitated. The letters flashed in her mind. He won't stop until he destroys me, and you. She must have found out, Amara said, her voice tight. That's why she left. He threatened her. Nicholas's jaw tightened. Then he didn't just ruin your life. He tore apart your family. Before Amara could respond, the doorbell rang. They exchanged a wary glance, the tension thick in the air. Nicholas stood and walked to the door, his posture tense. When he opened it, a woman stepped inside, thin, pale, and anxious. She looked over her shoulder nervously before speaking. My name is Ellen, she said. I used to work for the Hargroves. I think I can help you. Amara stepped forward. Why now? Why come to us? Ellen wrung her hands, her voice trembling. Because I can't live with it anymore. I know what Clayton did to your mother. Amara's breath caught. What are you talking about? Ellen glanced around the room, her voice dropping to a whisper. Clayton hurt her. He forced her to do things. When she threatened to go public, he turned the town against her. Spread lies. Destroyed her reputation. She left because she didn't want you to see what he'd done to her. Amara staggered back, the weight of Ellen's words crashing down on her. Tears welled in her eyes as the pieces finally clicked into place. Her mother hadn't just been running from threats. She had been running from Clayton himself. Nicholas stepped closer to Amara, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. Ellen, he said, his voice calm but firm, are you willing to testify against Clayton? Ellen hesitated, her face pale. I'll do what I can, but you have to protect me. If he finds out I talked. Nicholas nodded. We'll protect you. I promise. That night, Amara sat alone in the living room, staring at the flickering fireplace. The rage boiling inside her was unlike anything she'd ever felt. For years, she had blamed herself for her mother's disappearance. Now she knew the truth. Clayton Hargrove hadn't just taken her job, her reputation, and her peace. He had stolen her mother. Nicholas joined her, sitting silently beside her. Finally, he said, "This isn't just about exposing him anymore, is it?" Amara shook her head. "No, it's about justice. For me, for my mom, for everyone he's hurt." Nicholas smiled grimly. "Then let's make sure we win." The small hotel room was stifling, but Amara hardly noticed. She sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the street below. Nicholas paced behind her, his frustration evident in every sharp turn. "We're running out of time," Nicholas muttered. "The gala is in 3 days, and we still don't have enough to take Clayton down. The sheriff's useless, and Ellen's testimony will mean nothing without hard proof." Amara turned to face him. "We have to keep going. There's got to be something we're missing, someone we can turn to." Nicholas stopped pacing, his expression grim. "If there is, we're not seeing it." Before Amara could respond, there was a knock at the door. Both of them froze. Nicholas grabbed a nearby fireplace poker, one of the few items they'd salvaged from the house fire, and approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" he called. "It's Sheriff Whitmore," a voice replied. Nicholas glanced at Amara, his expression wary. He opened the door just enough to see the sheriff standing there, looking uncharacteristically nervous. Behind him stood Mayor Caldwell, his round face flushed as though he'd just run up the stairs. "We need to talk," the sheriff said, his voice low. Nicholas stepped aside, letting them in. Amara stood, crossing her arms. "What's this about?" The mayor wiped his forehead with a handkerchief, avoiding her gaze. "We don't have much time," he said. "If Clayton knew we were here, why are you here?" Nicholas interrupted, his tone sharp. The sheriff sighed, removing his hat. "Because we've had enough. We've been under Clayton's thumb for years, but we're done. We know what he's done to this town, and we want to help." Amara blinked, surprised. "Why now? Why not months or years ago?" The mayor shifted uncomfortably. "Because he's finally vulnerable. Your investigation has stirred things up. People are asking questions, and Clayton's losing his grip. But if you don't take him down soon, he'll find a way to silence all of us." Nicholas narrowed his eyes. "What do you have?" The sheriff pulled out a small leather-bound notebook and handed it to him. "This is Clayton's personal ledger. It's a list of payouts, bribes to officials, hush money to witnesses, and, most importantly, transactions showing exactly how he embezzled money from the town's accounts." Amara's breath caught. "How did you get this?" The sheriff hesitated. "Let's just say Clayton isn't as careful as he thinks. I've been keeping this under wraps for years, waiting for the right moment to act." Nicholas flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning the entries. "This is enough to bury him," he said, his voice steady but filled with determination. "If we make this public, he won't just lose his power. He'll go to prison." The mayor cleared his throat. "You'll have to be careful. If he finds out you have this before the gala, he'll come after you with everything he's got." Amara squared her shoulders, her voice firm. "He already has. But this time, we're ready." The next morning, Amara and Nicholas met with Ellen in the back room of a diner, going over the final plan. Ellen's hands shook as she reviewed her testimony, but her resolve was clear. "You're sure this will work?" Ellen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nicholas nodded. "The gala is Clayton's biggest stage. He'll be announcing his candidacy for mayor, so everyone important will be there. Donors, state officials, even the press. We'll present the ledger and your testimony at the same time. He won't be able to spin his way out of it." Amara placed a reassuring hand on Ellen's. "You're brave for doing this. We couldn't do it without you." Ellen smiled faintly, though fear lingered in her eyes. "I just want to see him pay for what he's done. To your mother, to you, to everyone he's hurt." That evening, Nicholas received another call from Clayton. This time, his voice was cold, the charm stripped away. "I warned you," Clayton said. "You're playing a dangerous game, and I'm not a man who loses. If you care about that wife of yours, you'll stop this nonsense. You have no idea what I'm capable of." Nicholas's voice was calm but firm. "No, Clayton, you have no idea what we're capable of." He hung up without waiting for a response, his eyes meeting Amara's across the room. "It's time to end this." While the sheriff seemed hesitant, he promised to look into it. Nicholas wasn't convinced, but it was a start. Amara couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on her as they pulled into the driveway of Nicholas's estate. It wasn't paranoia. She had seen the way townsfolk glared at her whenever she walked down the street. But this time, it felt different. It felt dangerous. She stepped out of the car, clutching her bag tightly. "Do you think the sheriff will actually help us?" she asked Nicholas as they walked toward the front door. Nicholas sighed, unlocking the door. "I don't know. He's under Clayton's thumb like everyone else, but the evidence is damning." But Amara knew it wasn't okay. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this. Someone wanted to send a message. The fire department arrived minutes later, followed by Sheriff Whitmore. He stood with them as they watched the flames consume what remained of the house. His expression was grim, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Fear or perhaps guilt. "This wasn't random, was it?" Nicholas asked, his tone sharp. The sheriff hesitated. "We'll investigate, but you've made a lot of enemies in town. You're stirring up things that people would rather keep buried." Nicholas's jaw tightened. "That's not an excuse. If you're not going to protect us, I'll call the state authorities myself." Sheriff Whitmore nodded but didn't respond. He walked back to his car, leaving Amara and Nicholas standing in the cold night air as the firefighters worked to control the blaze. The next morning, the town was buzzing with the news. Most of the original documents had been stored in a fireproof safe, but the loss of the house felt like a personal blow. "This is Clayton," Amara said finally, breaking the silence. "He's escalating." Nicholas nodded. "And he's trying to scare us. But all he's done is prove how desperate he is." "You're scared, Hargrove. I can hear it." There was a pause, then a low chuckle. "You're going to regret this," Clayton said. "And your little wife? She'll wish she'd stayed in the shadows where she belongs." The call ended abruptly, leaving the room in silence. Amara looked at Nicholas, her face pale but resolute. The grand ballroom of Willow Ridge's only luxury hotel shimmered with opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast soft light over polished marble floors, and the room buzzed with energy as the town's elite mingled, sipping champagne and sharing empty pleasantries. This was Clayton Hargrove's stage, his moment to cement his power by announcing his candidacy for mayor. Amara stood near the entrance with Nicholas, her hands clutching the strap of her evening purse. The weight of the small leather notebook inside was a constant reminder of what was at stake. She scanned the room, feeling the familiar sting of hostile stares and whispered insults. Tonight, though, she didn't care. Nicholas leaned in, his voice low. "You're ready for this?" She nodded, her expression steely. "I've been ready for years." On the far side of the room, Clayton stood surrounded by his loyalists, his booming laugh cutting through the noise. He was dressed in a sharp navy suit, radiating confidence as he shook hands and accepted congratulations that hadn't yet been earned. Ellen arrived a few minutes later, her face pale but determined. She joined Amara and Nicholas in the corner, her hands trembling. "Is it time?" "Almost," Nicholas said. "Stay close." The ballroom fell silent as Clayton stepped onto the small stage at the front of the room. He adjusted the microphone, flashing his signature politician smile. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth and commanding. "Thank you all for being here tonight as we celebrate the growth and prosperity of our beloved Willow Ridge. It's been my honor to serve this town, and tonight, I'm proud to announce my candidacy for mayor." The room erupted in applause, but Amara noticed a flicker of unease in Clayton's eyes as he glanced at her and Nicholas. He knew they were there for a reason, but he didn't know what was coming. As the applause died down, Nicholas stepped forward, his voice cutting through the quiet. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Clayton, but I think there's something the people of Willow Ridge deserve to know before they give you their trust." The room turned toward Nicholas, a ripple of confusion spreading through the crowd. Clayton's smile faltered. but he quickly regained his composure. "This is hardly the time, Nicholas," Clayton said, his tone dismissive. "I think it is," Nicholas replied, holding up the leather notebook. "This is your personal ledger, Clayton. It contains records of every bribe, every stolen dollar, and every lie you've told to keep this town under your thumb." A murmur spread through the crowd, growing louder with each passing second. Clayton's face darkened, his jaw tightening. "This is absurd," Clayton said, laughing hollowly. "A desperate attempt to tarnish my reputation. Where's your proof?" Nicholas nodded toward Ellen, who stepped forward, her voice trembling but loud enough to be heard. "I worked for Clayton for years. I saw what he did to people who got in his way. He destroyed families, silenced anyone who threatened him, and stole from this town to make himself rich. And she hesitated, glancing at Amara. He hurt people like Amara's mother." Gasps filled the room, followed by hushed whispers. Clayton stepped down from the stage, his face twisted with fury. "This is a baseless attack from people who have always hated me. None of this will hold up." Amara took a deep breath and stepped forward, her voice clear and unwavering. "My mother wrote letters before she left town. She knew what you did to her, and she was afraid for her life and for mine. You destroyed her reputation to protect yourself, just like you've done to so many others." Clayton's fists clenched, his mask of composure slipping. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he hissed. Nicholas smirked. "Actually, we do. Because we have your ledger, your former employee's testimony, and now, everyone in this room is witnesses to your lies. And just in case you thought you could wriggle out of this..." The doors to the ballroom swung open, and two men in dark suits stepped inside, badges glinting under the chandelier light. "Clayton Hargrove," one of them announced. "You're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and obstruction of justice." The room erupted in chaos as the agents approached Clayton. He tried to back away, his face pale, but there was nowhere to go. "You can't do this," Clayton shouted, his voice cracking. "This is my town." "Not anymore," Nicholas said, his voice calm and firm. As Clayton was handcuffed and led away, the crowd buzzed with a mix of shock and excitement. Some people murmured apologies to Amara, while others avoided her gaze, their shame evident. Later, as the crowd dispersed and the ballroom emptied, Amara stood on the balcony overlooking the quiet streets of Willow Ridge. The night air was cool, and for the first time in years, she felt like she could breathe. Nicholas joined her, a glass of champagne in hand. "You did it," he said softly. Amara shook her head. "We did it. And it's not over. This town has a lot of healing to do." Nicholas smiled. "Then we'll do it together." Amara looked out at the town, the place that had been both her prison and her battleground. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. And now, it was free. The following morning, Willow Ridge felt different. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. There were still whispers and lingering glares when Amara walked through town, but the undercurrent of fear that had always defined the place was gone. Clayton Hargrove, the man who had cast a shadow over the town for decades, was no longer untouchable. Amara sat at a table in the diner, nursing a cup of coffee as Nicholas reviewed the latest headlines on his tablet. The news of Clayton's arrest had spread like wildfire. "Local businessman charged in corruption scandal," the headline blared. Below it was a picture of Clayton being led away in handcuffs, his expression a mix of rage and humiliation. Nicholas looked up from the screen, his expression a mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion. "The state authorities are taking over the investigation. They've already frozen his accounts. Everything he's stolen will be tracked and reclaimed." Amara nodded, her gaze distant. "It's not just about the money, though. He's hurt so many people. My mom, Ellen, everyone he silenced." Nicholas reached across the table and took her hand. "You've done more than anyone else could have. You stood up to him when no one else dared to. That means something." Before Amara could respond, the diner door opened and Ellen stepped inside. She looked more confident than she had in days, though there was still a cautiousness in her movements. She approached their table, her smile tentative. "They're saying people might finally get their money back," Ellen said, sitting down with them. "The school might even reopen." Amara smiled softly. It's a start. Ellen hesitated, then added, I want to thank you. Both of you. I've spent years being afraid, and now I feel like I can finally breathe again. Amara squeezed Ellen's hand. You're braver than you think. You didn't just stand up for yourself. You stood up for everyone Clayton hurt. She knelt by the headstone, tracing the engraved letters with her fingers. Mom, I finally understand, she said quietly. You left because you had to protect me, and I don't blame you anymore. I wish you could see this. See that we finally won. The wind rustled through the trees, and for a moment, it felt as though her mother was there, listening. Nicholas joined her a few moments later, standing a respectful distance behind her. Ready to go? He asked softly. Amara stood, brushing the grass from her knees. Not yet. There's something I need to say. She turned to Nicholas, her expression resolute. I want to stay in Willow Ridge. I know it's not perfect, and it's going to take a long time for things to change. But this is my home, and I want to help rebuild it. Nicholas smiled, his pride evident. Then that's what we'll do. Together. Weeks later, Amara stood on the steps of the newly reopened schoolhouse, watching as children ran inside for the first time in years. The funds reclaimed from Clayton's accounts had been put to good use, and the town was beginning to heal. A woman approached her hesitantly, her expression uncertain. Miss Daniels, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. For everything. We were wrong to believe him. Amara nodded, her voice steady but kind. Thank you. But this isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else goes through what I did. As the woman walked away, Nicholas joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. Looks like the town's starting to come around. Maybe, Amara said, smiling faintly, but it's not about whether they like me. It's about making sure they see the truth. Nicholas kissed her temple. And they will. You've already done the impossible. Amara looked out at the town, the sun casting a warm glow over the streets. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. And now, she had the chance to make it better. For herself, for her mother, and for everyone else who had been silenced for too long.